With a new edition of Warhammer just being released, comes a new season of competitive 40k. We have the Leviathan chapter approved GT mission pack. Kind of. It doesn't actually look like this. This is just a very fancy Photoshop because I wanted to flex my skills again. We have the Leviathan Tournament Companion release, which is a free PDF available to download on Warhammer Community. And I want to say a massive thank you to Games Workshop for sending it to me early. The Tournament Companion is kind of like rather than having like a GT mission pack as we are used to, this is kind of like here's a free document that kind of changes the way that you're going to play Leviathan missions, the one that you either pre-ordered this weekend or got in the core box. And this is how you should use it for a tournament system or a tournament package, essentially. It changes a couple of the core rule concepts for match play, such as objectives and how you can actually walk on them now, which is very weird to get used to, and now we have to all unlearn it for a tournament. But it also changes some of the missions, some of the secondary cards that are available, like how many points they score, and it also comes with some recommended mission combinations. Obviously, we have these 3 random decks now. It actually presets all of that for you, which is probably what most tournaments would do anyway, but it gives you recommended ones, and it also goes over some new terrain layouts by Games Workshop using the perspex that they are so famous for, but ever so slightly adjusted. So let's go through it, starting with the mission sequence. So one of the main things is instead of having a random draw of the deck, if you're playing in a tournament, it recommends that you use the Leviathan Tournament Mission Pool, which is essentially sets the primary mission rule and deployment for each round. You don't have to use these, but these are like recommended, essentially. And once you've determined the mission, you place the objective markers. And one thing with the objective markers that has changed is that in 10th edition, a new rule was added where if you had the 40 mil objective marker you play on the battlefield, you can't actually end your movement on because it's a physical thing. But in the Leviathan Tournament Companion, it tells you can walk on them. So the only restriction is they can't be in the middle of a wall, essentially. So a wall can't be right on top of the middle, but you can stand on them, you can end a move, you can end a charge, etc. So that's like one of the weirdest rules that was in a GT that I ran this weekend. Obviously, I did a full stream talking about all the weird things from there, but that was like something that really came up quite a lot, and we kind of just said, well, we'll allow it for this charge or whatever. But a lot of the time, not being able to stand the objective is actually more of a hindrance in a competitive play when you've got like static terrain. Compared to like a narrative game, don't walk on the objective because it's your mate that you're supposed to be picking up, whereas a competitive game, it's a point of interest, which you can walk on. But there's also been 3 updates to the cards. So the cards that we are using, as I mentioned, are from the Leviathan mission pack, whether that was in the core box that you've pre-ordered because you want the new models, or whether you've ordered it separately. But one of the main changes is the deploy servo skull. So deploy servo skull is a bit of a controversial one. Some people call it football because you're essentially like running up and kicking the objective to your opponent. And the closer it is to your opponent, the more points you score. So at the end of your turn, if you hold the objective, you can move it 6 inches. That's how deploy servo skulls works. It's essentially the same. The scoring is ever so slightly different. So in deploy servo skulls, it's all cumulative, but now it is just set. It's like, if it's within this distance, you get this many points. If it's within this distance, you get this many points. The other 2 cards that have been changed are both secondary cards, and this is for deployed teleport homers and behind enemy lines, which are both fixed objectives. And they essentially score more points. So, deployed teleport homers, if you do it at the center of battle, you get 3 VP rather than 2. Whether you're playing tactical or fixed, it was previously 2 if you're playing fixed and then 3 if you're playing tactical. But now it's just 3 VP. And then behind enemy lines has also been changed. Obviously, this is another fixed secondary. It's going to score an additional point for ending your turn with 2 units in your army in any deployment zones if you're playing tactical. So it used to be 4 VP. Now it's 4 VP or 5 if you draw into it if you're playing tactical. Or if you only got 1 unit in there, rather than scoring 2 VP, it's going to score you 3 VP or instead of 5 because of 4. So essentially those 2 cards score a little bit more points during the game. So I think fixed secondaries are actually quite hard to achieve. Having them score a few extra points is quite nice, but obviously the behind enemy lines, if you draw into it, now it's worth 5 points rather than 4 if you draw into it, which is quite nice. So now we've got like the main mission change. So we've got a slightly different primary mission for deploy servo skulls. It's now recover servo skulls, but we've obviously got the secondary changes, and we can stand on objectives, but we've also got some recommended missions, and here they are. So here are the recommended tournament mission pool. So this is like quite interesting because it obviously only uses a few of the cards that are available, because there's like thousands of like possibilities when we're actually drawing all of these cards of deployments. There's like thousands of different types of missions. So usually that's like quite a few of the primary missions, but like Take and Hold is recommended like 1, 2, 3 times, whereas Scorched Earth is only once, for example. But I think the main limitation is the mission rule. So the mission rule, there's like 4, and that's like not a great deal. I think the mission rules in the mission pack are actually really interesting, but I can see for tournament play they can be quite confusing. So obviously having this recommended mission pool is quite nice, but it does limit your deck to what you're going to be using, because you're going to be basically playing Chilling Reign for quite a lot of it. Yeah, out of the 15 missions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them all have used Chilling Reign. So there's only 6 of these missions that have something different. 3 of them are Hidden Supplies, which adds an extra objective. Now, the Hidden Supplies is an interesting one, because Hidden Supplies essentially says before you start the game, you take the middle objective and move it 6 inches. You move it 6 inches towards a corner, and if there's a corner that's in no man's land, it has to go towards one of those corners. Now, there are 2 deployment types, such as this one, Take and Hold Hidden Supplies in Hammer and Anvil. There's actually no corner that is in no man's land, so the direction of the objective is almost random, and it doesn't really clarify who moves it. It doesn't clarify who decides. In this mission, players must set up an additional objective marker in no man's land unless the chosen battlefield mission rule is also in effect, which in the mission pool it will never come up because there's never 2 mission rules happening at the same time. The players must first move the objective marker in the center of the battlefield 6 inches directly towards one of the corners of the battlefield. If no man's land touches any corners of the battlefield, you must move the objective marker towards one of those corners. So I said, like, search and destroy, sweep and engagement, there's corners, and it's quite clarified. It's just going to split in no man's land. So if you're deploying here, your opponent's deploying there, it's going to split. But in Hammer and Anvil, no corners of the battlefield are in no man's land because of how it's deployed, you know? It's like that's the same as Dawn of War as well. So the direction of the objective is actually any direction as long as it's in no man's land, and I don't really know what the answer for that is. I have asked for clarification. I haven't heard anything as of filming, but where that objective actually goes, I don't know. So I thought that was quite interesting. I thought that would like raise awareness, because again, that's something else that came up in my event quite a lot, is not knowing where to send the objective if it's a deployment with no man's land in the corner. But there's some quite interesting ones. Obviously, we've got like quite a nice mix. The chosen battlefield is basically placing your own objectives rather than actually deploying them as normal. Scrambler fields basically means you can't deep strike onto objectives, or you can't scout or infiltrate. You can't basically deploy any type setup onto an objective. Basically, that's like the limitation. You can't use infiltrators, you can't use scouts, and you can't redeploy, and you can't land with reserves on objectives. So it makes it a little bit more interesting. It's a bit of a strange one, but it does only come up once with the ritual, which is the one where you're setting up more objectives as well. So it's like quite an interesting mission rule, but like a lot of them, it's like Chilling Reign, nothing happens. Hidden Supplies, you can have 6 objectives. There's 1 mission that we don't really know where the objective goes. And then Chosen Battlefield, a couple of times where you're placing your own, which is quite interesting. Especially on some of the terrain types, which we're going to go into in a minute. I think it'll be really interesting where the meta is for placing a type of an objective in a certain place. But without playing them all, I haven't had enough time to test out all of these missions yet. I can't really recommend which one's great, which one's not. But what we do have is preset terrain. Now, preset terrain is obviously terrain layouts. It tells you what type of terrain layout they recommend for each of these types of deployments. But there's 4 different types, and all of these are using the new Games Workshop Perspex idea, where it's essentially the Perspex that we know and love. We're going to chop the big ones in half, and then split them up. So as you can see, we have 4 different terrain layouts laid out like this. This is the center of the battlefield. And we have these big boxes, which are essentially where the Perspex are. And then the blue lines are essentially walls, and then the big boxes are essentially anything that's more than 4 inches high. So probably like multi-level. So this is like multi-level ruins and stuff like that. And this is just one example. I said there's 4 in the document. And it's quite interesting because one thing they've said is they don't want to put preset measurements on. So there's no preset measurements for these deployment layouts, for the terrain layouts, because it's about, like, they don't want people to game the terrain so they know exactly how far something is. So it's like, oh yeah, with a 1 inch advance, I always get in this building from this building, for example. They don't want people to do that. And also, during the game, terrain's going to get knocked. And they don't want people to like have to shift the terrain halfway through, which, in my opinion, I think it's a bit weird. I think having measurements on terrain is fine, because then you and your opponent can make sure it's in the right place throughout the game. And if it does get knocked, you don't really know where it's going to go back. You're just going to have to place it roughly. It might be slightly different. But these are all recommended terrain layouts. They aren't like the be-all, end-all. You don't have to run these. These are recommended for either new tournament organizers or inspiration for tournament organizers, essentially. So a lot of this is all recommended. It's like, we think you should do this. We think you should play these missions on these types of terrain with these rules. But it is all optional. But I thought it'd be quite interesting to have a look. For example, a Dawn of War mission. So Mission L and Mission N, which is Scorched Earth, Chilling Reign, Dawn of War, and Priority Targets, Chosen Battlefield, Dawn of War, both use deployment type Dawn of War, and they both use terrain layouts 1, 2, and 3. Now, I've actually drawn these up in Photoshop, so you can actually have a look at what the terrain layouts look like. So this would be, again, Scorched Earth would use Chilling Reign. Now, Priority Target is Chosen Battlefield, which means you'd actually place the objectives yourself, which means this objective layout doesn't really work for that instance. But I think it's interesting to have a look at the deployment and what terrain you have in and what you don't have in. And this is like Games Workshop recommended. Now, all of these terrain pieces are ruins, which is essentially everything's going to be blocking line of sight for visibility, except for towering. Towering is going to be able to see straight over all of this, which I think actually makes a lot of these terrain layouts quite sparse in the deployment zone, because there isn't a great deal of places to hide your army from knights or wraith knights, etc. like for this one layout. Now obviously this is one of 3, so this is layout 1, this is layout 2. Now this has a little bit more here. Whether this is tall enough to hide your army, I don't know, but it's also outside of the deployment zone, like roughly. Probably it might be just in, it might be just out. There's no measurements. I'm just trying to line it up to the center of the objective. Now there's quite a lot across the middle. The only open zone is through the center, and then you've got these ruins in your deployment zone to try and stop it. But the objective in the middle is wide open. The objectives on the left and right have a little bit of hiding. The one in the deployment zones are kind of nicely hidden. Again, unless you're playing towering, which I think is probably like a big oversight for maybe some of these terrain layouts. In practice, I don't know what terrain they've actually physically got on there. I think a lot of people are worried about towering, and I don't know if this helps. But terrain layout 3, again, you've got a little bit here. You might be able to hide in this building to hold your objective. You've not got a lot of places to hide your army. The middle looks quite open. This is like one big ruin. Again, against most targets, this is like quite heavy, but for towering in particular, which currently hasn't been addressed, it does look quite scary. It does look relatively scary. And then it's not lined up perfectly, but you do have some like intersecting objectives, so you're gonna have to like slightly shuffle the terrain ever so slightly just so they're not being intersected. But yeah, it's like there's quite a lot of mid-ground stuff on all of these terrain types. There's like quite a lot of mid-ground stuff. Like this one is really heavy, really heavy for like most armies. You just don't have a lot of places hiding in deployment zones. So you've got anything that moves like quite fast with fly, you might be in a bit of bother. You could be behind here, obviously, because all of this is obscure and it's touching, so you can like hide in this bottom left corner, which is quite heavy. So like the middle is really heavy until we start looking at towering. So if we take towering out of the equation for now, this looks like quite a heavy board. This one, again, kind of heavy. It's a little bit more open in the middle, but there's a little bit more play around the side, which is quite fun. And then this one, relatively heavy in the middle because you've got these big, massive blocks of building. You got these nice corners to kind of hide and deploy stuff. But again, anything with speed is going to be really good on these deployment types. But then we've also got Search and Destroy, which is obviously the corners deployment. Now, Search and Destroy is used in Mission A, Take and Hold with Chilling Reign, so it does hold objectives. It's also used for priority targets and hidden supply, so it'll have an extra objective. So we'll have an extra objective, basically like, if we can draw that out, let's have a look. We'll basically have an objective there maybe, and then we won't have one in the center instead, which is quite nice as well. It makes it a little bit of a bloodbath in the middle. You got like a little bit of play to grab them from behind walls and stuff, but then also that you got like the center to play in and go grab them. Mission D with deploy servo skulls, so football, you're gonna be able to kick the middle one around, which is gonna be quite fun. Supply drops where the one in the no man's land start disappearing. So these ones, one of them becomes alpha, one becomes omega, and then they start like disappearing from the battlefield halfway through the game, which is quite fun. So for those missions, it's quite interesting. Again, for hidden supplies, we know exactly where the objective is going to go. And for these recommendations for Search and Destroy, we're going to be used 1, 3, and 4. So again, for this one, you got quite heavy terrain in the middle, lots to hide behind in your deployment zone because all of this and this corner to hide on the objective, which is quite nice. You're going to be able to like hide here, run over to this objective, for example. Layout 3, a little bit more, you got a bit more to hide behind in your corner, but it's a little bit further back. The middle is wide open. The middle is a very scary place to be. There is nothing there. And then these two objectives looking like they're quite open as well. Now, obviously, this isn't a perfect layout. And again, there's no specific measurement, so you can move them. But this is as close as I get. The objectives are bang on the right place, and the middle is almost there. So, like, your home objectives are quite well secured, but the 3 in no man's land are quite literally no man's land. And then layout 4. This one's quite a nice one. You've got a little bit of play in the middle. There's you can hide a little bit. Maybe you could be like, I'm going to move these ever so slightly closer so I can play around the objectives. The 2 in no man's land are quite well. You got like a little bit of play there behind some walls to hold the objectives. And then deployment zone is completely blocked off. So I think for this one, this is like quite a heavy terrain layout. I think layout 3 for this one is suicide, and then layout 1. So layout 1 and 4 are quite nice, I think, for this mission. Now we could go through all of them. I can't Photoshop them all that fast, so excuse me. But they're the main changes. That's what they recommend for Leviathan. So this is like essentially our tournament season. For whether this is 6 months, 12 months, 3 years, I don't know. But this is what they're recommending. These specific missions on these types of layouts, if you can do it, if you want to buy terrain and buy perspex, or whether you want to like copy this. Obviously, at my event, if you want to come down, we've got one in August at Sanctuary Gaming Centre, and then at the end of the year we have Super All Stars, which is our 120-man cash prize event. We'll be using this layout along with 4 other types of layouts as well, which are all going to be updated in ready for 10th edition. Because obviously we use multiple terrain types, but it's quite interesting. Like the set missions, I think that's good. I think tournament organizers having some set missions that kind of like work together and are intended to work together is really nice. It's a nice backbone to be like, okay, we're gonna play these missions, and then like terrain and stuff, you can kind of, if you've got like 100 tables of the same type of terrain, you're not gonna go out and buy perspex for it. You're gonna like make a layout ready for it. But it's nice to have some recommendations to see what Games Workshop are intending. Albeit some of them do look like suicide, but some of them don't, and that's kind of nice that it's not gone this, and this one terrain type, because then that just could be a disaster if there's one like that layout 3 with like all the objectives in no man's land and no cover around them. But again, because there's no measurements, if you don't like it, you can just move it. Like, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Now, it also gives you some like idea about how to pair players, how to rank players in the rankings and stuff like that. And again, it's all recommendation. You don't have to do any of this. It is all just kind of like, we recommend you do this. This is what we're probably going to be doing at our own events. And it's nice that they put it out for free. That said, whether it's any good or not is going to be up to actually people going out and testing it out and seeing what happens. And I'm going to a tournament this weekend, and I'm hoping they do use some of these like recommended layouts or whatever. But we'll see. Like, it's going to take a bit of time for people to catch up, essentially. So there you go. There's the new Leviathan companion / chapter, essentially chapter approved amendments for playing Leviathan missions in tournaments. Let me know what you guys think. Have you spotted anything that I've missed? Have I not gone over something? What do you think of these terrain layouts? I think obviously we've talked about like perspex and footprints of ruins, what with problems they can cause. With like, again, when I broke 10th edition before it was released. Vehicles are going to struggle to get line of sight unless you've got towering, so I think it's probably going to be a little bit of a towering meta until we see some sort of update, but that's just my opinion. But that's it. There you go. Let me know what you think, and otherwise have a lovely day, and I'll catch you Monday at 7 PM live, as I am every single week, and Wednesday morning at 10. Bye!